Hi, everyone. I'm here with my friend Alana Zeitchik, and excited for this conversation. Hi, Alana.
Hi, Jay.
So maybe just to start, you could give us a little bit of a background on where home was growing up, what sort of family you were in, and just life as a child, and
Oh, we're going way back. I didn't know we were going there.
go as far back as you wish, and
Of course,
just
of
give us
course. Okay.
kind of a
Yeah,
run through of what life was growing up and how life
yeah.
was. Yeah.
Um, I had a really great childhood. I'm very fortunate. I grew up in New Jersey. I was born here in America in New Jersey. My mom is from Israel. She grew up in Ramat Gan, Israel, and my dad is a classic Brooklyn Jew. So I always say I'm like half Yemenite Israeli, half Brooklyn Jew is my is my. I don't even use Ashkenazi. I say Brooklyn Jew because people get
Yeah,
it.
yeah. And how did
Um,
your folks meet?
my parents met at a bar, the good old fashioned way. My mom worked for El Al after the army, and she was here living in New York briefly, kind of like, in her 20s and traveling and working at her friend's sister's boutique, her and another Israeli. And they went to a party and she met my dad at like a party at a bar. But within a year, they were actually married. It was pretty quick.
Wow, wow,
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. And my mom is though she's one of five siblings. My grandparents on my mom's side came from Yemen, so they grew up in Yemen, and they were part of the Operation Magic Carpet in 1949, which brought most of the remaining Jews from Yemen to Israel. They lived in not in one of the port cities or not in one of the cities. They lived in a middle of nowhere village in complete and utter poverty. And yeah, and then they made their way to Israel, and my mom did not grow up well off. She grew up as a first generation Israeli to poor Yemenite parents who I always say, built their life in Israel brick by brick. My Saba was the librarian at Bar Ilan. He's very much a scholar and a religious man. And my Sapta was an angel of the kitchen. and and
Saba and
they,
Savta meaning grandparents,
yeah,
grandmother and
yeah,
grandfather. Yeah,
yeah. And I've never met two people in my life who take nothing for granted, truly. Like every small thing. My mom used to always joke, like, every year here in America, right, you get like a new, bigger TV. But my Saba having like the same TV he's had for like what, 15 years. He's like, wow, look at this amazing thing, you know?
and
Uh,
probably more content than those who are looking for the upgrade every
oh
step,
yeah,
right?
yes.
Yeah,
Like definitely more contentment for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And really appreciating the simple things and knowing, where they came from. But I have a really big family in Israel and I'm very connected to that side. I've been going to Israel every year. I mean, not every year of my life, but almost every year of my life since I was a baby. I think my first trip to Israel, I was 6 months old. And
And before you get into that, tell me about your father's side and your father's ancestors.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
so my dad's side, my great grandparents came from Russia. So they came in the, I guess, earlier 1900s before the Holocaust. So they were able to sort of make it before that happened. But obviously there was already
Yeah,
anti-Semitism was running rampant
yeah.
across Eastern Europe and whatnot.
Similar to my
So
family, we're all from Eastern Europe, sort of Romania, Russia.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I believe actually, I believe that at least on my grandfather's side, I think they came into America via Canada,
Hmm.
actually. They didn't go through Ellis Island. But my last name, Zaichik, actually means little rabbit in Russian. It's a term of endearment that they use still to this day, to talk to their children or loved ones. It means bunny, basically. I say it means bunny rabbit. So it's cute. And so, but my grandparents grew up in Brownsville, which was incredibly Yiddish, European, Jewish, Ashkenazi neighborhood, as immigrants, as American immigrants. And my dad was born in like Midwood, Flatbush area, and went to Midwood College. And my grandfather was like a salesman, and my grandmother she worked as a secretary. She was always like, my grandmother's still alive. She's 98 years old. And she was always like a woman that was doing things and was very proud of herself for having a job and working. And I'm proud of her for that too. It wasn't so normal at the time, you know? And yeah, my aunt is here, but my dad's side, I don't have any cousins or anything.
Mhm.
So my American side, actually, people in my life, as my family, extended family in America, are actually a lot of my mom's Israeli friends and their kids. And we built a very strong community in that way here of Israeli immigrants and their families. But my Israel side is huge. So I've always been,
And do you have
I always,
siblings?
I do. How could I forget my siblings? They would be like, you're so you. I have two younger brothers.
Right, right.
Justin and Liam, and I'm very close with them. They both live here in Brooklyn, not too far from me, and I'm very lucky to have the close relationship that I do with them. And yeah, and so I grew up in New Jersey, and um, I loved it. I always knew I would move into the city. I mean, moving into New York, I've been living on my own in New York for 17 years now, that was always what was going to happen. I'm very much a New Yorker. I love being a New Yorker. But I definitely am very fortunate in that sense that I have loving parents who are still together, which is not always the norm nowadays.
Yeah.
There's a lot of closeness in my family.
And
And
we have a friend in common. I'm the founding investor of Winston House, a cool place for music and community on the west side of LA. I forget how did you meet a
Corey,
common friend, Corey, the
yeah.
founder of Winston House?
So one of my best friends is a person named Drew Harper, who was my first roommate when
That's
I moved back to New
right.
York.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I love
yeah. And
Drew.
Drew's
Yeah,
brother, Corey Harper, was the first kind of
sure.
like
Yeah, I love
project
those guys.
from Winston
Yeah,
House, and they grew up with Corey McGuire. So about 8 years ago, I was taking a hiatus from my career. I needed like a pause, a millennial pause, if you will, as they call it. And I spent some time in LA at the Winston House when it was just, a house on Electric Avenue.
yeah.
And
No, I
I
have
used to
great
bake
memories.
cookies for them.
So you stayed there?
I did. I stayed there. I eventually got myself like an Airbnb down the street
Hmm.
for a little while. And I kind of became like their big sister.
I love that. Yeah,
Go
you
over
might
there.
remember I did an inscription or an endorsement of Drew's book,
Yeah,
Space
yeah,
at the Table, which is
yeah,
an amazing book,
it is.
an important one actually. Um, yeah, so you began talking about your connection to Israel, but before I get into that, actually,
Yeah.
what was your schooling like, elementary and high school? Did you have Jewish education or
Yeah.
yeah?
I have a mix of education in that sense, right? So I had, I learned Hebrew. Well, my mother spoke to me in Hebrew, for example, when I was really little. I went to Solomon Schechter at first, which is, a private Jewish day school,
Yeah, they
but
have that
eventually
in
my
Montreal.
parents,
Yeah.
yeah, eventually my parents put me into public school, which sometimes I'm like, why did you do that? But I think I was honestly Jewish enough. But then I went to Hebrew school and I went to a conservative, we were members at a conservative synagogue in New Jersey called B'nai Shalom in West Orange, New Jersey. And so my Hebrew school was 3 times a week. I didn't just do like the one day a week, like some of maybe my Reform friends. I was there every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 hours and every Sunday morning for 2 hours. So, a mixture of Judaica and prayer, of course, and Hebrew, but the Hebrew, they never taught me any more Hebrew than I already knew, I will say, which I have a complicated relationship with my Hebrew. I'm actually more passively bilingual. It's a whole thing. But yeah, so and then I went to public school and I actually though really loved going to public school. And you know, I am so grateful for my public school upbringing. I was always around people of different cultures, of different races and ethnicities. They knew me. Most of my close friends were all Jewish, but I used to always invite my non-Jewish friends to Passover and they knew about my culture and I knew about theirs. And I eventually went to college in the Midwest at a school that really had very little Jews at all. For most of my college friends, I was their first Jewish friend, or for some of them, the first Jew they'd ever met.
Mm.
So I also tried to bring them into my world a little bit, but it was my first awakening to a world where people didn't know Jews. I
Right.
didn't think about it because my life was so Jewish and everyone who was non-Jewish around me knew Jews. Um,
And how was
So
that experience? Did you feel any tension or issues about your Jewish identity, or was it not an issue at all?
it was complicated. I never felt I a lot of it was my kind of East Coast, New Yorker, New Jersey identity and my political identity as being a liberal and a Democrat in an environment where, and this was during a time where Bush was president, and was running for president. And I used to have a lot of arguments with people on campus about Bush and about gay rights, for example, at the time, and gay marriage and things like that. I
What
did
did you
realize how
study, by the way? Sorry to
Northern Illinois
jump in.
University,
Say that again.
Northern Illinois University.
Oh, what did you study?
Oh, communications, organizational and corporate
Got it.
communications.
Got it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and when we talk about, I guess, what I've been doing now, it'll make a lot of sense that my
Sure.
senior thesis was about lobbying and rhetoric. I was always like really passionate about rhetoric, and I always aced all my public speaking courses.
I can see why. So tell
Yeah.
me, you're in the middle of talking about debates on issues like same-sex marriage and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that, and I tried a lot of the time to just open people's eyes up to like not just the political nature of it, just like the human nature of everything. And I never, in terms of being Jewish, though, I did have one experience with a very good friend of mine. It was the only time in my life I've ever personally, in this context, been affected by like blatant anti-Semitism, like unconscious anti-Semitism. And it was a friend of mine who went into 7-Eleven and came back in the car, and a really good friend, and noticed that he didn't get all of his change back. And he mentioned that the guy Jewed him down or something like that. And
Yeah.
I remember going, oh, and he looked at me and he was like, oh my God, and he realized in that moment
You
how
know,
wrong
I,
it was.
I didn't even know that that was a term until way later in life.
Me either. It
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
first time I was like,
Yeah.
I was like, what are you talking about?
But what I would hear a lot growing up is I got gypped, and I didn't realize that that's a reference to gypsies, etc.
Oh,
So
I didn't. Interesting.
yeah, yeah,
About that.
there's all these terms in the vernacular people
Yeah.
don't even realize. I mean, we can get into that too. Like that's
Yeah.
blatant, but the tropes, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, tell
And
me more about that. Yeah.
so it was, and in that moment, he also was like horrified at himself. It was not, and I think it was a moment for him and for
Right,
me.
right,
And
right.
he never would, but it does, because of my experience, I know how isolated people are in environments in the US, for
Yeah, yeah.
example, to their access to Jewish people and their experiences. And so it does give me a frame of reference of how little most people know that are outside metropolitan areas with high Jewish populations.
Hmm.
Uh, so I always try to kind of keep that in mind. And I'm not always like shocked anymore if someone doesn't know anything about my culture or my people. It does make it harder to handle to
Yeah,
deal with
yeah,
the
yeah.
discourse now. But it's just a reality. Like there's actually not, it proves how little of us there actually are,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
and
And I
how we
think,
don't have the influence that people think we do.
and I think to my point about the fact that I didn't even know about this term, it's like the flip side of it. It's like we may have blind spots in terms of what's being said out there.
Hmm. Hmm.
But so you did this degree in communications, and then what happened from there?
Then I moved back to New York quite literally immediately. I think I
Yeah.
graduated and I was back in New York by that August. I followed in my dad's footsteps in advertising, and I worked in more traditional advertising world in the beginning of my career. And I eventually worked at companies like Hulu when it was still a startup, and Vimeo. And then I really moved more into digital publishing and media. So companies like Vox Media and BuzzFeed, where I spent a really huge chunk of my career working in roles where I was a bit of like a kind of revenue strategy and leader in between the editorial teams and the revenue side, I've like being a diplomat. So navigating those complexities between the two sides, balancing both people's needs, to work cross-functionally and work with a lot of different people, and be able to mold myself, I suppose, to speak those different languages and help push the business forward while also retaining, the integrity and the goals of the editorial needs. And I really loved that for a long time. But it wasn't in the end, throughout this journey, I also explored a lot of passion projects in relation to my Jewish identity and Israel. In 2016, went to Israel to spend the summer filming my savta, my grandma, um, and her cooking because she cooks Yemenite food and there's no recipes to it. And my family in Israel takes it for granted. So I thought it
I
was my
love it.
responsibility, and I wanted to explore my own identity through her and the simplicity of being in the kitchen and what that means for her.
I love that.
Um,
Love to see that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm sure my mom
I can
would love
send it
that
to
too.
you.
Yeah.
So I went there and I was inspired by the work I had done at Vimeo, and I went, and it was my first, I had never picked up a camera in my life. My cousin helped me and I just started to be with her and film her. And then when I got back to the States in the fall, she had a stroke
Oh,
and she passed away a year later.
oh wow.
So, and it was very contentious, thing between my mother and I. My mom really wanted me to go back to work and was like, "What are you doing? Why are you filming SEFTA? Like, this is so silly." Like, my mom is a very pragmatic person. And I remember when that happened, I said to myself, I was supposed to be there. I was supposed
That's
to
a
film her.
real blessing that you have that. That's amazing.
Mhm.
Maybe we could rewind a little bit. You started to talk about the fact that your connection to Israel and the fact that you the first time you were there was like at 6 months. Tell me
Yeah.
about all of your experiences spending
Uh,
time in Israel.
My experiences are family experiences, truly. Like, I did do birthright when I was in my 20s. It was really, of course, we did like touristy things while I was growing
Yeah,
up and
yeah.
going to Israel. But my experiences were being at my Sabta and Sabas and eating food and going to Eilat with my cousins and going to camp in Israel. Like, my mom would put me in day camps and playing with my cousins and watching Friends together and eating bamba and beastly and you know, going to the beach all the time, going to the beach and the
Which
hot sand and the
which city were
watermelon
you
and
centered
stuff.
in? Which city were you centered in when you
Tel
were
Aviv, Tel
Tel Aviv?
Aviv.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
Saba still lives in my same apartment that my mom grew up in, which is in Ramat Gan,
yeah.
um, right next to Bnei Brak, like right directly next to it.
Hmm.
And he still lives in the same very small home that she grew up in. And that's where most of my family is around Tel Aviv, mostly. There's obviously some that are a little bit further south, but most people are around the Tel Aviv. So that's where I spend most of my time still.
Amazing. Well, let's fast forward to October 7th,
Mhm.
and where you were, what happened that day, specifically how your family was affected.
Yeah. Well, I was here in New York. I woke up to a flurry of messages on WhatsApp from my brother and my cousins. We have a cousin group chat on WhatsApp because there were attacks, and we get the alerts. I get the alerts on my phone for the attacks. And my cousin Sharon, one of my closest cousins, she lives on Kibbutz Nir Oz with her husband and her twin daughters, Emma and Yuli, who are 3 years old. And they are very close to Gaza. I've known this for years, how close they are. So we've always been concerned about her for any of these attacks, and she wasn't responding. And
And how old is she?
she's 34. Yeah. Um, and I then discovered in this moment that my cousin Danielle, her older sister, and Danielle's 5-year-old daughter Amelia had also been there with her. So at this point, I know that something is happening. I don't know yet. It's still early in the morning here. And I say to myself, okay, it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. I mean, there's nothing else you can say to yourself. We didn't have any information yet. And I eventually went on with my day. And then my brother and I realized no, this was not, we saw the news and what was happening, and this was not a normal rocket attack. We sat here in my apartment watching the news, waiting for news. And I I tell you, I made every excuse in the world of what could be happening to them. I said, okay, they just don't have service in the Mamad, the bomb shelter. There's just no service in there, or they've turned off they're trying to intercept what Hamas is doing. So I made every excuse you could. It's a coping mechanism.
Sure.
I cannot explain what it feels like. It is surreal. And at this time, my mom calls me screaming and crying. My cousins are like daughters to her. This is my mom's oldest sister's kids. My mom is wailing on the phone. they're not in the house, they're gone. The army came in and they're not there. We don't know where they are. I learn at this point that the good news is that there's no blood that the house is burned, but there's no blood in the mamad. So we have a sense that maybe they're alive, but there's no way to know, but they're not there. At this point, I see a video on Instagram my brother shows me that came from TikTok. And it is a video of hostages from their kibbutz because you could see this one woman's face who her husband saw her. And so it was immediately on the news. And I see a man that looks like my cousin's husband from the side. And I say to my brother, I think that's David. And my brother is like, no, 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 no. Like, what are you talking about? And I just had this gut, I had this feeling like, I was like, that looks like him because I see a small brown haired child as well. But we didn't know. You can never ever imagine that you would see your family being kidnapped by terrorists on a TikTok video. So like in this moment, I'm just saying to myself, I don't know, like it just doesn't make sense. So I try my best to be strong. And the next day, we immediately went to my parents' house to be with my mom and my dad and to all be together. And my aunt at this point confirms that the video is them. And I see, and I was like, I knew it. It's David and it's my cousin Sharon and at least one of their daughters. At this point, I take to Instagram to tell people what's happening to my family. I had already started doing this a bit, like on my Instagram stories and stuff. But I didn't know what else to do but to scream about it and to say, this is happening to my family. They're being kidnapped. And that's kind of like the October 7th experience and my few days kind of afterwards was shock, but a lot of crying. Every day I woke up crying. The minute
How many of your family were kidnapped?
So in my immediate family, 6 total. So Danielle and her daughter, Sharon, David, and their twins, who are 3, and Amelia is 5.5 when she was taken. And then there were more, like David's younger brother was taken, his younger brother's girlfriend. And so there's an extension beyond for David's family. But in my family, people that related to me, 6, which I think is probably the highest number. One of the highest numbers of one of the highest numbers probably from any individual family. Sometimes when I talk about it or when I think back, it feels like a movie that happened that like I was watching and not part of. But I just, I've always been the American one in my family, out of my extended family. And I just had this sense, I had quit a job 2 days before all of this. I happened to be available. I probably would have done it no matter what, whether I had a job or not. But I was like, I have to use my voice and my identity the best that I can. Like I said by like October 9th, I think I posted on Instagram and I said I would scream to the ends of the earth for them. And I would. It's what I did. So by the 11th of October, I was on the news. And on October 13th, I spoke at the UN and gave a speech at the UN demanding their release. And thereafter went on every single news station you could ever imagine. I always joke, like, no, it's just somehow how I made it from NBC to CNN Romania. Like I was all over the world speaking about them.
And how did these news stations get wind of you and your willingness to speak? Did you reach out? Like, did you work with somebody? How did was it organic?
I very quickly got a pro bono PR team that does crisis management. And this was through what I was sharing on Instagram. And then, a friend of a friend led me to someone and this really amazing crisis management team who had done a lot of work with George Floyd's family as well, came on board to help me. And so they're really experts in the more like traditional PR world. They also helped us build an Instagram and we did that. And so I had a task force with them. I had a task force with my family in Israel and all their friends, hundreds of people. Like, I've never been busier. I was on the news every day, almost. In the beginning, I did lots of local news as well, like in New York and DC, for obvious reasons. We also did a lot of outreach. We had someone doing government relations for us. So we spoke with a lot of different government offices, Kristen Gillibrand and Governor Hochul and Chuck Schumer's office and Hakeem Jeffries' office. And I spoke with all of them, but my family are not American citizens, which made it a bit hard.
Mhm.
And so it made my need to be on the news even louder
Right.
because I wasn't really speaking to my representatives because my family was not American. And then, I think I mentioned this before, I'm very much a progressive and a liberal and very much pro-democracy American. And I live in Brooklyn. I live in an extremely liberal neighborhood. I live in Bed-Stuy. Um, and I spend Williamsburg, Brooklyn is a place where I used to live, where I spend still so much of my time where my brothers live. And it was very clear to me how quickly my community sort of brushed aside my pain, what I was going through, and not just the hostages. It felt personal to me. It felt like a personal attack and like a personal disregard that my
And when you
suffering was.
say when you say my community, do you mean your friends?
And in terms of my very close friends, no, I
Mhm.
would not say that. I know there are other people who haven't been affected the way I have, who
Yeah.
have had falling outs with very close friends. I
Hmm.
know that.
Hmm.
I personally have not. Um, I
Like the
found,
bigger circles, you're saying.
yeah, found people that were more acquaintances or
Yeah.
like, a hairdresser of mine or people who know me, who know my brothers. Like I found that to be, it wasn't exactly always that they suddenly were like against me. It was the silence. It was the quiet
I understand. Yeah.
that I really struggled with. And so I eventually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this, about being left behind, and the silence and the quiet of feeling like my community, right? A community that is always very vocal about injustice was not able to hold these two truths at the same time. And why was I able to hold these two truths at the same time, but they were not when I was directly impacted by it? And, my longing for wanting them to help me hold my grief and how lonely it felt. Really, it felt very, besides my family, it felt very lonely. And I will say, I eventually, got a lot of people. I've been lucky that I've had a very supportive community start to build around me on social media. I'm not a particularly contentious figure. I don't want to be, and it's not who I am. And so I did receive so many like friends who were coming here and bringing me groceries, sending me Uber credits for Uber Eats and, for Grubhub and all these things and just like wanting to support me. I had friends come over and do my laundry for me. Like I really saw so many people step up, but everyone that steps up, they were behind the scenes. They
Hmm.
were doing important work to help me keep fighting.
Right. Right.
But the kind of social media warriors, the activists, as you say, those were the quiet ones.
Hmm.
And but I was very focused and I made a decision to not allow myself to be emotionally charged and emotionally triggered by that, to focus on what mattered, really. Which is what I said in many of my speeches and a lot of things I've advocated for is to focus on what matters. Um,
Did you or have you do you continue to interact much with the family forum, the families of
yeah.
yes.
I still do. I obviously worked with them. Well, I was always in like, there's a guy named Omer who runs the family forum here in New York.
Yeah.
And he's been a wonderful support system for me and helped me along the way. I don't really get involved in the rallies at all. This is a bit of a personal choice. I in some ways, my relationship, I'm not against them, of course not. I don't feel they're particularly effective. I think they're more of a solidarity movement than a political movement. And so I've sort of come to resent them a little bit. Um, here in the US. I'm much more aligned with the protesting and anti-government movement in Israel. It's
And
really
why feel the resentment at all, even if it's a
the resent
solidarity movement? Yeah.
the resentment is sort of like a feeling that perhaps some of the Jewish community in America is not, or in the West, is not quite hearing the experience, like is missing the plot, I say. It's like, and I ask people a lot, what stops you from criticizing the government? What stops you from pushing for a deal over and I say perhaps the resentment is actually more the phrase bring them home. That's where my resentment had started to develop over time. The first time that happened for me was after my family returned home. 5 of them came home in November. The children, of course. And news came out that the IDF had killed 3 hostages who were shirtless, waving white flags. And my response was shock and horror and disappointment and anger. And the community around me, the Jewish community, who very much I know supports me. I have no doubt. I say it gave me a bit of a thoughts and prayers moment. I felt like it was like, oh, well, that's awful, but. And I thought to myself, something is missing here. And
So for you, bring them home in a way is like an empty slogan.
it became too, from a political perspective, it
Uh-huh.
became too easy to interpret
Mm-hmm.
however you choose. So for
Right.
someone like me saying bring them home, it means do a deal,
Right. Right.
use diplomacy to bring them home. To
Right.
someone else, it's saying use military, use violence to bring them home. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not something that I personally align with, and
Yeah.
that has not proven to actually work. Um, I care about what works, and
Right.
diplomacy works.
Right.
I also care about many other things, but we saw a deal work, and so this polarizing environment of your ceasefire now crowd and your bring them home crowd, it's become polarizing political rhetoric that functions to keep people separate. When in my UN speech, I said the words, "We must come together to stop this." I said that on October 13th. I already knew what was coming. And my worst fears in terms of that happened, the division and the polarization. And I think I kind of made it my mission to fight against that and to try and illuminate that there is an alternative. There is a different option that most of that silent majority, I think those who I was seeing as silent were perhaps just not sure there wasn't a place where they could fit. And
So
so
what's the vision?
the vision and what was,
To bring those who just don't feel they fit in one place or another. What
yeah,
would you like to accomplish moving forward? I know we talked about
yeah,
anti-Semitism in particular, but it
mm,
looks like your vision is a broader one, which I think can help uh,
yeah,
to combat anti-Semitism
absolutely.
in a more visionary way. Yeah,
Yeah. So I have a theory
yeah.
that what's lacking, in particular in my generation, millennials and younger generations, Gen Z, and those of us who are building the future, right? Who are going to be in politics and be building the future. Um, I believe that there are a lot of lack of courage. When I say courage, I use like the Hebrew Jewish concept of it, which is ometz lev, which means heart strength. And heart strength is this idea that we really have an unlimited reserve of tools that we can access when we are met with discomfort, when we are met with things that we don't like, and we are met with pain or something like that, to respond differently, to respond in a more courageous fashion. And to me, this kind of answers on a very human level what's missing, because what I saw throughout this journey and through the polarization is something I had been seeing already in social media and American politics and whatnot. But right, there are a lot of people who are too susceptible and vulnerable to jumping on a bandwagon. There is a lack of critical thinking skills and media literacy. There is an intolerance. So there is this idea of boundaries, very important concept of boundaries that we need in societies, in our behaviors, but it has gone too far because the boundaries have become so rigid that people don't feel safe exiting that boundary. And so they don't engage with any spaces or people or ideas that don't confirm their bias. And this is not how we make progress.
Hmm.
And then there's an extreme overwhelm in what you see on social media and the news. We're living in a time where we have unprecedented access to news and information and from around the world, and people are too overwhelmed. And so what I see is lacking are those skills, are the
Hmm.
behavioral skills, psychological skills, the community to be
Right.
able to respond differently. So my goal is to, from a mission perspective, to instill more of those skills and to courage into people to allow them to, number one, be able to tolerate things they don't like, to be able to have the really difficult dialogue that is required to make the progress that they long for. So comes from a lot of, I saw this happening on social media and I thought, I'm a fixer. How can I fix this? How And it's because I taught myself how to respond differently, because I was forced to do so, because my family was taken. I didn't have the luxury of sitting around and just like resharing influencer posts about what was going on. I had to pause and think, is this benefiting my advocacy and my family and getting them home?
Hmm.
And
Why do you think people are afraid? I don't know if what the correct word is. I forget. You named three things. The first one, I think, essentially relating to vulnerability.
Mhm.
Why do you think people are afraid to put themselves out there? Is it because they may fear losing a job, or losing, like, what is it? It
I think
doesn't
it's
seem like it's apathy
identity.
necessarily. It seems
No,
like people are frozen.
I think it's identity, it's fear of rejection,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, fear of being rejected by your peers, right? If the zeitgeist and the trend is saying being pro-Palestine, it makes you a good person,
Right.
right? It's very noble, and everyone should support the Palestinian right to self-determination, to freedom, and to equality. Everyone should support that. But to identify as that, as who you are, and we're seeing this on TikTok, on Instagram, the number of people who have watermelons in their profile, in their names, they're saying, this is how you will now know who I am by my alignment with this. It's less about the cause in many ways. I'm not saying, but it's strange the way that they've interwoven this with themselves and who they are. And so any attack on them, the Palestinian cause, feels like an attack on them as individuals. And for Jews and Israelis, but especially Jews in the West, I find they feel any attack on Israel is an attack on themselves. So there's a very like, it is attack on one's identity. And so there's a bit of ego at play, right? That's what fear of rejection really comes from, is someone not understanding you or feeling like you're less of a person than you really are. And we're coming out of like a cancel culture world where you're not allowed to make mistakes. I just said to someone right now in a WhatsApp group of Jews who kind of got together post 10/7 because they didn't know, they needed a support group of some sort. And so I kind of entered into that chat and I helped them here and there with things. And just the other day, like yesterday, there's like a gay bar here in Brooklyn that decided to not play the Eurovision finale this weekend. They were originally planning this big kind of gathering around Eurovision because Israel is in the finale, and the Jewish community and the Jewish gay community was like, they responded with, how could you do this? And they took it back. They decided, you know what? We realized this was wrong. We're going to actually move forward with it. And
Hmm.
someone in this group said, I don't like, they weren't happy. They were like, whatever. They kind of like, the damage is done. And I said to them, listen, I suggest that you try to give them grace. They reflected, they changed course. A world without redemption is far too cruel. We
Hmm.
need to allow for the not just nuance, for redemption, for people to change, for things to get better. Otherwise, we kind of just live in this kind of downward spiral of doom. And I think it's the disconnect. Like, I think so many things are coming to a head. Social media has disconnected people and the pandemic made that worse. So just human connection is um, uh, at risk. And so finding a community of pro-Palestinian people gives people a false sense of connection. So I think they're all really basic, like human needs that people are trying to fill through activism, and it's not working. And it could be a lot more effective if we did it in a way that was together. And I say this, when I say together, I mean not in a groupthink fashion,
Right.
but when you can walk alongside people who you don't agree with on everything.
You mentioned before we started the recording that you had some opinions on the encampments and the stuff that's happening
Yeah.
on campus. So love to get your take.
Yes. So I have a more, I don't know, I have perhaps a very nuanced approach to it. I feel many things about it. I feel very much a supporter of democracy and right to free speech and the right to protest without military interventions. I don't believe in using military force. Um, I feel that we're lacking in our society other better solutions like where the social workers and the therapists and the faith leaders to come in and help change these dynamics on campuses. I think that the idea of right boycott, divestment, and sanctions is not anti-Semitic, but I do think that much of the rhetoric and some of the actions around it have devolved very quickly into anti-Semitism. And there is an extreme lack of consensus about what is and is not anti-Semitism. And we're seeing this flourish on campuses, sometimes in ways that are very clear and apparent and violent rhetoric. I've spoken to a good amount of people, and a lot of them say that they don't feel physically, but they feel unwelcome. And that's a problem. And I think like if it was any other minority group, nobody would stand for any of the instances, whether they're isolated or not, that have happened to some of these Jewish
I think that's
students.
right. I think that's right. And there's a lot of instances of Jewish students being physically blocked from going
Yes,
from going to
yes.
class as well.
Mhm.
But I
But
think that's absolutely right. There's a huge double standard, I think. Yeah,
there is.
yeah,
But at the same time, when I talk about courage and building courage, this applies just as much to Jewish students as Jewish people as anyone else.
hmm
I do think that there is a discomfort with certain language about Israel and Zionism that Jews need to learn is not anti-Semitic, that is not an attack on them, that is a genuine attack or a genuine criticism of a government that deserves criticism because you know who criticizes their government? Israelis.
hmm
No one criticizes Israel more than they do.
Right.
Um, and I think that Jews need to be armed with better information and skills and tools to be able to navigate this and discern when something is actually problematic or not. At the same time, we still know that anti-Semitism is most problematic in the far right. While yes, we're seeing an emergence in the far left and we got to address it, it's still more problematic on the far right. And the way anti-Semitism works, right, and what we're seeing happen with campuses, and my concern with the media attention and the focus on it from both political parties, if you will, is that anytime the world places their gaze on the Jewish community, it is a way to cover the other things that are actually plaguing our society, the problems in our society. So not only are these campus protests inflaming problematic anti-Semitism, becoming out of line, um, but the leaders of these groups are like SJP, for example, is very like, you know, there's one chapter that wanted to boycott the Hillel on campus. That's anti-Semitism. They don't want to allow conversation and dialogue. And so these are issues that the universities need to tackle better with experts who can handle this that are not police officers. At the same time, too much there's an disproportionate focus on the level of anti-Semitism. It's happening. But the way that I've seen kind of right-wing politics in America weaponize it to focus so much energy on it as a problem is very concerning to me because I feel that in some ways we as Jews are being used. We're being used for political gain and for political rhetoric and for political policies and ideas that aren't actually in our best benefit. Um, and I'm concerned about how this will work out in our election this year. But I think
Just as an aside, why do you feel that that there's a greater danger on the far right than
because
on the
even
far left?
even from a measurement perspective, there just is like the ADL and the Center on Extremism within the ADL. Still, what they're fighting more is the far right, white nationalist neo-Nazis. There's still more of a danger, and there's just more anti-Semitism that is captured in that demographic than there is on the
And
left.
isn't it ironic? We were talking about this as well before we started recording. How you know all these inversions, including Israeli Jews being described as white colonizers,
Mhm.
right? Ironically, the white supremacists hate us as much as anybody,
Exactly.
and in that sense, we really can't consider ourselves white, whether we're
No,
Ashkenaz or not.
no,
And as
we
I was
cannot.
saying earlier, our friend Van Jones points out very clearly that something that a lot of people don't realize, and that's that half of the Israeli Jews in Israel are people of color.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And they'll tell you in Israel, like there are dynamics within Israel that my mom grew up very dark-skinned Yemenite with an Arabic accent because the accent from Yemen was an Arabic accent.
right.
And my mom had to teach, she taught herself, her and her sisters taught herself how to have a more softened Israeli accent without the certain syllables that sound more Arabic. Like, of course, there are dynamics of racism that exist in every single society, but the projection of American race onto the Middle East is simply not right. It doesn't work that way. And I think there's a disconnect between many people here and the dynamics of the Middle East and the people and the culture and the geopolitics of it all. And, you know, I could talk about Iran and how that plays and how that's really where we should be focusing our attention as a society. And
Yeah.
I've started to talk to people who are Middle Eastern diaspora folk here who are not just Israeli, people who are Iranian and from Yemen, who very much want to start building a coalition in the Middle Eastern diaspora world of like, how can we band together to start focusing on the head of the beast
Hmm.
that is really keeping the whole Middle East from being free?
I think that's absolutely right, and we're connected to many in the Iranian, let's say, diaspora. We have a lot of friends who we're working with in common cause to see what we can do with I don't know what you might call it, the tip of the spear, etc. But that's that's of course a key problem is the Iranian regime.
Mhm.
Um, Tell me about your remaining immediate family member.
Yeah,
Would like to know more about them, even on a personal level, to
yeah,
personalize this a little bit. And I'm thrilled that your other family members are your
yeah.
other immediate family members at least are home. Yeah,
Who remains is David. His name is David Cunha. It's my cousin's husband. My cousin Sharon, they were together in Gaza. They were them and their twins. It's a long story. One of the twins was by herself for 10 days. Um, but he's still there. We don't know anything except for what when they took him from her when she was in Gaza. He's
how old is he? What's his background?
34. He's an
Yeah.
Argentinian Jew. So he grew up on the kibbutz. He's like a real kibbutznik. He's an engineer, like an electrical engineer. He's a man, you know, who likes to work with his hands, and he is such a kind soul. My cousin, like, I remember meeting him for the first time and just knowing he was right for her. He adores her and loves her. He is the best father to those. He's also a twin. He's actually an identical twin and he has twins.
Hmm.
So he has this really special connection with his daughters being twins. And he's such a playful father and um, really loved living on the kibbutz. And they're really a beautiful, amazing family. He's a good guy. And Um, and yeah, he's Argentinian, so he speaks Spanish and Hebrew, and not so good English. Um,
And how are your family members doing that are back? I guess they were released after 54
yeah.
days.
52 days, 49
52.
and 52 because they were separate.
Mm-hmm.
Danielle and Amelia, it's very different for each family member. So Danielle is my oldest cousin. Her and her daughter Amelia came back and the kids, I'll say for the kids are resilient, of course. So in general, kids adapt a bit better, but the trauma shows like Amelia is really she struggles to meet new people, especially men. And if they don't speak Hebrew, it's really problematic.
Mm-hmm.
She'll have like a breakdown all of a sudden. A lot of the games she plays are like hiding from the bad guys and things like that. But Danielle, who she came back and be similarly to the way I stepped up to the plate and became an advocate, that's what she's done. So she is like famous in Israel now, pretty much, and has become an incredible advocate on behalf of the hostages. And she does speaking events all the time, and she's pouring herself into advocacy work. And I'm really proud of her. She's found a great sense of purpose and resolve through that. Sharon is her husband remains, right? She went through 52 days of absolute hell, complete, I mean, really torture. I mean, in a house that was bombed, kept in a hospital, no food, lost 20 pounds. I mean, it's really inconceivable what she's experienced. Having one of her kids taken away from her for 10 days, like it's just a trauma like I could never imagine. And David is her soul in her life. And she's very fragile. So she, in the beginning, was doing the speeches and doing the media, and we all thought they would be back sooner. She's at a place of what I would call hopelessness. It was her birthday last week, and she turned, I guess, 35. And I spoke to her. We FaceTimed over the weekend, and her eyes are just empty. She is desperate for information, desperate for him to return. She, I mean, her kids are what keep, and she's very lucky to have the family that we have around her, supporting her and living with her parents and that. And the kids, right? Kids help to bring joy into her life. And so she is an amazing mother and hands-on with them. But she is completely lost and broken. And all I want to do is try and help her, and I can't. And
Mm-hmm.
really, um, it's really a challenging feeling. I wish I could do something more. There's only so much I can do. So I try my best to make her laugh or whatever I can, but she's very broken.
Anything else you wanted to add? This has been a really illuminating conversation, which I hope
Yeah.
the audience will find illuminating as
I
well.
think, you know, I think I like to say I strangely am an optimist. And I think that through all of this is a bit of a chasm that's opened up. Through this destruction, it is illuminating the things that we have to fix. And this is going to require us to do things differently than we've done before. So I always say, right, it goes back to my whole idea around having courage. We have to have courage to do things differently than we've done before, which means giving up some control or having conversations that we don't have to have. And I think if we as a society can rally around that, efforts that don't perpetuate the polarization and the algorithms and the things that have been keeping us disconnected, we can slowly heal this, and we can mend it. We can bring peace to the region, and we can fix what's happening in our own society. But I just want to encourage everyone to think through that lens as much as you can, that like, how do we invest in opportunities, projects, companies, experience, anything that is focusing on the things that are a little bit more risky, but that may have a greater return. If that makes sense.
And I'm looking forward to collaborating with you in that regard.
Me too.
Um, Praying for David that he should come home immediately, and all the hostages, and ultimately we should all live in peace. Thank you,
Yes.
Lana. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.